I slammed the glass door of the office building behind me so hard I thought it might shatter. It didn't, which somehow made me even angrier. My hands were shaking as I loosened my tie and stalked across the parking lot. The security guard watched me from his booth, but wisely said nothing. "You can take your new policies and shove them straight up your—" I muttered the rest under my breath, repeating what I'd just told my now former boss to his face. 10 years with the company, and this was how they thanked me, cutting benefits, extending hours, and telling us we should be grateful to keep our jobs. I got into my car, tossed my badge onto the passenger seat, and sat there for a minute with my forehead against the steering wheel. The satisfaction of telling Franklin exactly what I thought about him and his corporate bootlicking lasted about as long as it took me to reach the highway. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, reality was setting in. I had just quit my job. No notice, no backup plan, just pure, self-destructive rage. "Smart move, Dave," I said to myself as I unlocked my apartment door. Real smart. 3 weeks later, I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, staring at my laptop screen. The bank account balance displayed there had dwindled to a number that made my stomach hurt. Rent was due in 4 days. I had exactly one interview lined up for a position that paid barely above minimum wage. I scrolled through another page of job listings, each one worse than the last. Assistant manager at a fast food place, night stalker at a grocery store, data entry for a medical billing company, all paying just enough to ensure I'd fall behind on bills a little more slowly. I was about to close my laptop when a new listing caught my eye. It had just been posted. Night guard needed. Private residence. 75 Otter HR. Twice monthly. I blinked and read it again. $75 an hour? For a night guard position? There had to be a mistake. Maybe they meant $750, but as I read the brief description, it seemed legitimate. A private security position at a residential property, working overnight shifts twice a month. The listing included a phone number with a Boston area code and an address in Beacon Hill, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. That explained the pay rate. Rich people could afford to overpay for security. I reached for my phone before I could talk myself out of it. A man with a refined, almost aristocratic accent answered on the third ring. "Hayes residence." "Hi, I'm calling about the night guard position," I said, trying to sound professional despite sitting in my boxers surrounded by empty cereal bowls. "Ah, yes." The man's voice remained perfectly measured. "Are you available for an interview this afternoon?" No screening questions, no request for a resume, just straight to an interview. I glanced at the time, 11:30 in the morning. "Yes, I can make that work." "Excellent. 3 o'clock. The address is in the listing." He provided no further details before ending the call. I showered, shaved, and put on my one good suit, the same one I'd worn to my cousin's wedding last year. The pants were a little loose now, a side effect of the unemployment diet I'd been on. I knotted my tie carefully and practiced my most reliable, trustworthy expression in the bathroom mirror. The Beacon Hill address led me to a 4-story brownstone with gleaming windows and an ornate door. Beside the entrance, a small brass plaque read simply, "Hayes." The neighborhood exuded old money, clean sidewalks, luxury cars, and not a single piece of trash in sight. I pressed the doorbell and heard rich chimes echo inside. Moments later, the door opened to reveal a tall man in his late 50s, wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than my car. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly styled, and he regarded me with calm, assessing eyes. "Mr. Walker, I presume?" he said, extending his hand. "Richard Hayes. Please come in." His handshake was firm but brief. He led me through a marble-floored entryway into a study lined with bookshelves. The room smelled of leather and expensive cologne. He gestured toward a chair across from a massive oak desk and seated himself on the other side. "Would you care for tea?" he asked. "No, thank you," I replied, trying not to fidget. Everything about this place made me aware of my second-hand suit and scuffed shoes. Hayes nodded and got straight to business. "You're here about the night guard position." "Yes, sir. I have experience in." He held up his hand, stopping me. "Your previous experience is irrelevant to this position, Mr. Walker. This job has very specific requirements that traditional security work wouldn't prepare you for." I closed my mouth, confused. Was this some kind of weird setup? Was I about to be offered something illegal? "Let me ask you a few questions," Hayes continued. "First, how well do you follow instructions?" "Very well," I answered automatically. "Even when those instructions seem unusual or unnecessary?" I hesitated. "I suppose it depends on the instructions." A flicker of approval crossed his face. "Good answer. Blind obedience isn't what I'm looking for. Rather, I need someone who will follow specific guidelines once they understand their importance." He leaned forward slightly. "Next question. How do you react to unusual situations? Do you panic easily?" "I stay calm under pressure," I said. "In my last job, I handled crisis management for client accounts. That was stretching the truth, but not by much." "And your tolerance for, let's call it ambiguity, unexplained circumstances?" This interview was getting stranger by the minute. "I'm adaptable," I said carefully. "I can work with limited information if necessary." Hayes nodded again. "Final question. Are you currently in a relationship, Mr. Walker? Any family obligations that might require your immediate attention at unpredictable times?" "No relationship. My parents live in Michigan, and we're not particularly close." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and removed a folder. "The position involves providing overnight security for a residential property I manage. The work is simple, but requires strict adherence to certain protocols. You would work 2 nights per month from sunset to sunrise. The pay is $75 per hour, paid in cash at the conclusion of each shift." I did quick math in my head. A 12-hour shift at that rate would be $900, $1,800 a month for just 2 nights of work. "What exactly would I be guarding?" I asked. "A mansion belonging to a wealthy family currently traveling abroad. The property contains valuable art and antiques. Your job is to ensure nothing is disturbed during your shift." It sounded too good to be true. "And why just 2 nights a month?" "We have a rotation of guards," he said smoothly. "Each works specific nights based on their availability and our needs." That made sense, I supposed. A place like that would want constant coverage. When would I start? "Tonight, if you accept the position." Hayes slid a contract across the desk. "This outlines your responsibilities and compensation. You'll receive detailed instructions at the property itself." I skimmed the document. It was surprisingly short, mostly stating that I agreed to follow all provided guidelines and maintain complete confidentiality about the property and its contents. "This is a trial position," Hayes added. "After your first night, we'll determine if you're suited for permanent employment." Every instinct told me this was weird. The pay too high, the interview too quick, the job too easy. But my bank account balance flashed in my mind. My landlord wasn't going to accept excuses about a weird job offer when I couldn't pay rent. "I accept," I said, signing the contract. Hayes took the paper back, his expression unchanged. "Excellent. The address is here." He handed me a business card with an address written on the back. "Arrive at sunset. The staff will provide your instructions." He stood, signaling the end of our meeting. "I look forward to hearing how your first night goes, Mr. Walker." As I walked back to my car, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. I had a job, an incredibly well-paying one. But something about Hayes and his strange questions left me unsettled. Still, for $1,800 a month, I could handle a little weirdness. How bad could one night of guarding a fancy house possibly be? The interview with Richard Hayes kept replaying in my mind as I drove through Cambridge in the fading daylight. His questions had been strange, and the job offer even stranger, but the promise of $1,800 for 2 nights of work overrode any lingering concerns. I checked the address on the business card again as I turned onto a tree-lined street of historic homes. The GPS insisted I had arrived, but I slowed the car, searching for house numbers among properties hidden behind tall hedges and stone walls. When I finally spotted the iron gates, I almost drove past them. They stood at least 12 feet tall, with ornate metalwork that belonged in a museum rather than someone's front yard. Beyond them stretched a long driveway that curved through immaculately maintained gardens toward what could only be described as a mansion. I pulled up to a small intercom box and rolled down my window. Before I could press the button, the gates swung open with a soft mechanical hum. Someone was expecting me. The driveway felt endless as I drove at a crawl, taking in the sprawling grounds. Perfectly trimmed hedges, stone sculptures, and flower beds lined the path. The mansion itself loomed ahead, a massive Victorian structure that must have been built when Cambridge was still farmland. 3 imposing stories of dark stone and intricate carvings with rows of tall windows reflecting the last rays of sunset. I parked in a small courtyard near the front entrance, feeling increasingly out of place. My second-hand Honda looked like a toy next to the property's grandeur. I grabbed my backpack containing the few items I thought might be useful: a flashlight, phone charger, water bottle, and a paperback I probably wouldn't read. The front steps were wide enough for 10 people to walk side by side. At the top stood a door that belonged in a medieval castle, dark wood with iron fittings and a knocker shaped like a lion's head. I reached for it hesitantly, but the door swung open before my hand made contact. The man who greeted me was so still, I initially mistook him for a statue. Tall and impossibly thin, he wore a perfectly pressed black suit with a crisp white shirt. His face was gaunt, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. Despite his elderly appearance, he had to be at least in his 70s. His posture was impeccable. "Mr. Walker, welcome. My name is Donald Coleman. I serve as caretaker for the estate." His voice was deep and formal, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Please come in." I stepped into an entrance hall that made me feel like I'd wandered onto a movie set. The ceiling soared 2 stories above, with a crystal chandelier that must have cost more than my entire apartment building. Marble floors stretched in every direction, and oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls. "The family is currently abroad," Donald said, leading me across the hall. "They maintain several residences around the world and rotate between them seasonally." "How many people live here when they're home?" I asked, trying to make conversation as I followed him. "The immediate family consists of 4 members," he replied without turning around, though they frequently entertain guests. We passed through a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a sitting room filled with antique furniture, and a music room containing a grand piano that gleamed in the fading light. Each space contained objects that belonged in museums: vases, sculptures, ornamental clocks. "The house dates to 1875, Donald continued, seeming to sense my awe. "It has been in the family for 5 generations. They take great pride in preserving its historical character." Despite the mansion's grandeur, something felt off. The rooms were immaculately clean, but the air had a stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. The temperature seemed to drop the further we walked into the house. "This is the library," Donald announced, opening a set of double doors. "You'll find it comfortable for your overnight post." The library was straight out of a Gothic novel, 2 stories tall with walls of dark wood bookshelves accessible by a rolling ladder. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, with several seating areas arranged throughout the room. Leather-bound books filled every shelf, their spines creating patterns of deep reds, greens, and browns. "Your primary responsibility is to monitor the premises and ensure nothing is disturbed," Donald said. "The security system handles external threats, but the family prefers to have someone physically present inside the house at all times." He gestured to a desk near the window where a telephone, tablet, and small monitor showing security camera feeds were arranged. "The tablet contains floor plans of the entire property should you need to reference them. You have access to all areas except the locked rooms on the third floor." He paused. "Those belong to the family and contain personal items." I nodded, though I wondered why anyone would lock rooms in a house that already had security and a night guard. Donald reached into his jacket and removed a folded paper. "These are the guidelines for your shift. I must emphasize the importance of following them precisely." I took the paper and unfolded it. The header read, "Night Shift Protocols" in bold type, followed by a numbered list. As I scanned the items, my eyebrows rose involuntarily. 1. Remain inside the house until sunrise. 2. Do not answer the door between midnight and 4 a.m. under any circumstances. 3. If piano music begins playing, go immediately to the red leather chair near the library fireplace and remain seated until the music stops. 4. Do not enter any room containing more than 4 people. 5. If you hear your name called, respond only after the 3rd repetition. 6. Keep all hallway lights on throughout your shift. 7. If you encounter the woman in red, maintain eye contact, but do not speak to her. I looked up from the paper, certain this was some kind of joke. These seem unusual for security protocols. Donald's expression remained perfectly serious. The family has specific requirements for how their property is to be maintained in their absence. These guidelines have been developed over many years. "Right," I said, fighting the urge to laugh. "And the woman in red is," a term the family uses for one of their associates who occasionally visits to check on the property. His tone remained matter-of-fact. "She has her own key and may appear without warning." This had to be some kind of hazing ritual for new guards, probably a camera hidden somewhere to record my reaction. "The kitchen is fully stocked should you require refreshments," Donald continued, seemingly oblivious to my skepticism. "The staff quarters are through that door if you need to rest, though we request you remain alert throughout your shift." He glanced at his watch. "I must attend to my other duties now. The day staff has departed, and I will return at sunrise for the changing of the guard." "So I'll be completely alone in the house?" I asked, suddenly less amused by the bizarre rules. "Yes, the property is quite isolated despite its proximity to the city. You're unlikely to hear any external disturbances." Donald walked toward a side door I hadn't noticed before. "The security system is armed. Should you need assistance, use the telephone on the desk. My number is programmed into it." Before I could ask any more questions, he slipped through the door and closed it behind him. I heard his footsteps fade, then nothing but the soft tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, the last traces of daylight had vanished. Through the tall windows, I could see only darkness beyond the manicured lawn. The mansion felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing. I looked down at the list of rules again, shaking my head. Someone clearly had a strange sense of humor. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, deciding to explore my temporary domain before settling in for what promised to be a very long night. As I stepped back into the hallway, the overhead lights seemed dimmer than before, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The oil paintings lining the walls, solemn portraits of people in period clothing, appeared to watch me as I passed. Just my imagination working overtime in this creepy old place. For $75 an hour, I could handle a little discomfort. I squared my shoulders and began walking deeper into the mansion, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. 2 hours into my shift, the novelty of guarding a mansion worth more than I'd earn in several lifetimes had worn off. I needed to familiarize myself with the layout, so I set off from the library to explore the property methodically. The floor plans on the tablet helped, but nothing compared to walking the actual space. The main floor alone was larger than my entire apartment building. Every corridor led to another wing, another set of rooms, another collection of priceless artifacts. The hardwood floors announced my presence with gentle creaks that echoed through the empty spaces. No matter how softly I tried to step, the old boards betrayed my movements. I passed through formal sitting rooms where antique furniture sat arranged as if waiting for long-dead guests. Dining areas with table settings that hadn't been disturbed in months. Studies filled with leather-bound books that probably hadn't been read in years. The artwork alone must have been worth millions. Oil paintings in heavy gilt frames depicted stern-looking men and women in period clothing. Most wore expressions that suggested sitting for their portrait had been a tedious obligation rather than an honor. Their eyes seemed to track me as I moved past them. Just a trick of the light, I muttered to myself, noticing how shadows played across the canvas surfaces. By 10 o'clock, I had mapped most of the first floor in my mind. I paused in what appeared to be a smoking room, complete with leather armchairs and a humidor that still held cigars. That's when I heard it. Distinct footsteps from the floor above me. Not the subtle settling of an old house, but the clear, rhythmic sound of someone walking. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the ceiling to the other. Steady, deliberate, impossible. According to Donald, I was alone in the house. The family was abroad. The staff had left. Yet someone was clearly walking around upstairs. I retrieved my flashlight from the library and approached the grand staircase. Its carved wooden banister curved upward in a sweeping arc, leading to the second floor. I hesitated at the bottom step, listening again. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" I called up, my voice sounding smaller than intended. "This is security. Is someone there?" No response came except for the distant ticking of clocks scattered throughout the mansion. I climbed the stairs, wincing at each creak beneath my feet. The second floor was laid out in a similar pattern to the first, a central corridor with rooms branching off on either side. Unlike the common areas downstairs, these appeared to be bedrooms and private spaces. The hallway stretched into darkness, despite the wall sconces I'd switched on during my ascent. I moved forward cautiously, checking each room as I passed. Guest bedrooms with untouched coverlets. A music study with sheet music still open on a small writing desk. A child's room with antique toys arranged on shelves. No sign of anyone. I reached the end of the hall and turned back, puzzled. I was certain I'd heard footsteps, but every room was empty, every bed made, every surface dust-free thanks to whatever cleaning staff maintained this place. After completing my sweep of the second floor, I returned to the staircase. Maybe I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks in empty houses, especially ones as old and creaky as this mansion. I was halfway down the stairs when I noticed her. At the far end of the main hallway stood a woman in a flowing red dress. She had her back to me, silver hair styled in an old-fashioned way that matched her clothing. The dress looked Victorian, with intricate detailing that caught what little light filtered into the corridor. My first thought was that this must be the woman in red, mentioned in Donald's strange list of rules. My second thought was that I should call the police. Someone had broken into the house. "Excuse me," I called out, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone. "This property is closed. How did you get in here?" She turned slowly. Her face was elderly, but held a strange timelessness. What struck me most were her eyes. Dark, hollow pits that seemed to contain nothing but emptiness. She fixed those eyes on me without blinking. I remembered the rule. Maintain eye contact, but don't speak to her. But I'd already spoken, and besides, this had to be an actual intruder, not some ghostly figure from Donald's bizarre instructions. "Ma'am, I need you to identify yourself, or I'll have to call the authorities." I blinked, and she was gone. Not, "She walked away," or "She stepped into another room." One moment she was standing at the end of the hall, and the next, she had completely vanished. No sound of retreating footsteps, no closing door, nothing. The air around me suddenly felt much colder. I could see my breath forming small clouds as I exhaled. The temperature in the hallway had dropped at least 20 degrees in seconds. "Stress," I said aloud, my voice too loud in the silent house. Exhaustion, new environment. I was creating hallucinations because I was tired and on edge. That was the rational explanation. The woman couldn't have vanished. She must have ducked into one of the side rooms while I blinked. The temperature drop was just some quirk of the mansion's ancient heating system, but deep down, I knew better. No one could move that quickly. No heating system changes temperature that drastically in an instant. Still, I forced myself to approach the spot where she had stood. The floor was empty, no footprints in the plush runner carpet, no indication anyone had been there. I checked each room off the hallway methodically. A powder room, a small study, a closet filled with coats from various eras. All empty. I spent the next hour methodically checking every room I could access on the main floor. I told myself I was being thorough, doing my job, ensuring the property was secure. But in truth, I was trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I'd seen. As midnight approached, the mansion seemed to change. I couldn't put my finger on exactly how, but the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners deepened. The silence took on a waiting quality, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I returned to the library, consulting the list of rules Donald had given me. I read number 7 again. If you encounter the woman in red, maintain eye contact but do not speak to her. Too late for that. I'd already spoken to her and she'd vanished. What did that mean? Was I in danger now? This is ridiculous, I told myself. There's no woman in red. There's no one here but me. A soft thud came from somewhere upstairs, followed by what sounded like whispering. I turned my head toward the ceiling, listening intently. Another thud, louder this time. Old houses make noise, I said, trying to reassure myself. They settle. Pipes expand and contract. Wood creaks. The whispering continued, just at the edge of audibility. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence of hushed conversation. It seemed to move from room to room above me. I checked the security feeds on the monitor. All the exterior cameras showed nothing but dark gardens and empty pathways. The few interior cameras in the public spaces displayed empty rooms bathed in the soft glow of wall sconces. According to every verifiable piece of technology, I was alone in this mansion. So why did it feel like I was being watched from every corner? I paced the library, trying to focus on the job I was being paid to do. Guard the house, keep an eye on things, make sure nothing was disturbed. Simple enough. But each time I heard another sound, a soft shuffling from the dining room, a low creak from the music room, a whisper that might have been my name from the hallway, my certainty eroded further. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 12 times, marking midnight. The sound was deep and resonant, filling the library with momentary normalcy. When the final note faded, the silence that followed seemed even more complete, more consuming. I sat at the desk, staring at the security feeds and trying to ignore the coldness that had seeped into the room. The night was only halfway over, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited in this house was just getting started. The grandfather clock's final tone had barely faded when the mansion settled into an even deeper silence. I tapped my fingers nervously on the desk, watching the security feeds that showed nothing but empty rooms and hallways. According to the cameras, I was completely alone. Yet the persistent feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I tried to distract myself by examining the floor plans on the tablet. The mansion had 3 full stories, plus what appeared to be an attic space and a basement level. Most of the 3rd floor was marked as private family quarters, the locked rooms Donald had mentioned. I zoomed in on the 2nd floor, mentally tracing the path I'd taken earlier while searching for the source of those footsteps. The tablet's screen flickered briefly, displaying a momentary static before returning to normal. I frowned, checking the battery level. It showed fully charged. 30 minutes after midnight, I heard it. The first notes were so faint I almost thought I was imagining them. Delicate piano keys struck with precision, sending a haunting melody drifting through the mansion's corridors. I sat up straight, listening intently as the music grew slightly louder. Someone was playing the grand piano I'd seen in the music room. I got to my feet, moving toward the library doorway. The music continued, an unfamiliar classical piece that echoed strangely in the empty house. The notes didn't seem to travel naturally through air. They bypassed my ears and resonated directly inside my skull. Donald's list of rules suddenly flashed in my mind. Rule number 3, if piano music begins playing, go immediately to the red leather chair near the library fireplace and remain seated until the music stops. I scanned the room quickly. Near the massive stone fireplace sat a high-backed leather chair, its deep burgundy color barely visible in the dim light. When I'd explored the library earlier, I'd barely paid attention to it. Just another piece of expensive furniture in a house full of antiques. The music intensified, the notes becoming more complex and layered. I hesitated, torn between investigating the source and following the bizarre rule. "This is crazy," I muttered, even as I found myself moving toward the chair. I settled into the red leather seat, which felt unusually cold against my back. From this position, I had a clear view through the library's open double doors into the adjacent music room. The grand piano sat in the center of that space, its polished black surface reflecting the minimal light. Someone was sitting at the piano. The figure's back was to me, hunched slightly over the keys. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, but something about their posture seemed wrong. Too angular, too still between movements. The music swelled, filling the mansion with sound that seemed impossible from a single instrument. The melody had a mathematical precision to it, each note placed with perfect timing, yet it carried an emotional weight that made my chest tighten. It wasn't music meant for human ears. I gripped the arms of the chair, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave, to run from this room and this house. But something kept me fixed in place. Whether the rule's strange power or simply my own terror, I couldn't tell. As my eyes adjusted further to the dim light, I could see the pianist's hands. Long, pale fingers stretched impossibly across the keys, covering intervals no human hand could span. They moved with unnatural fluidity, as if the bones beneath the skin were more suggestion than substance. Each finger was too thin, too long, ending in points rather than proper fingertips. I blinked hard, telling myself it was a trick of the light, an illusion born from shadows and fear. But when I looked again, those horrible hands continued their perfect performance, pressing keys that should have been beyond their reach. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The piece seemed endless, flowing from one movement to another without pause. I remained frozen in the chair, barely breathing, as the temperature in the library dropped further. I could see the cloud of my breath forming with each shallow exhale. The music shifted into something darker, discordant notes mixing with the melody in ways that made my teeth ache. The pianist's movements became more aggressive, those long fingers striking the keys with force that should have broken them. I tried to look away, to focus on anything else in the room, but my gaze kept returning to the figure at the piano. Through the open doorway, I could see that the pianist wore something dark and formal, their silhouette blending with the shadows around them. Finally, after what must have been nearly an hour, the music began to slow. The melody simplified, returning to the haunting refrain that had started the performance. The final notes hung in the air with unnatural persistence, vibrating in my bones long after the sound should have faded. Then silence returned, heavy and absolute. The figure at the piano remained motionless for several long seconds. Then, with jerky, uneven movements, it began to turn. I pressed myself back into the chair, heart pounding as the pianist slowly rotated on the bench. I wanted desperately to close my eyes, to block out whatever I was about to see, but some primal instinct kept them open, as if closing them would somehow be more dangerous. The figure turned until it faced the library doorway. Its features remained hidden in shadow, except for where eyes should have been. There, twin voids of perfect darkness caught what little light existed and swallowed it whole. Not eye sockets, something deeper, emptier, like holes punched through reality itself. We stared at each other across the distance between rooms. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even blink as those impossible eyes fixed on me. Then, like ink dissolving in water, The figure began to dissipate. It didn't stand or walk away. It simply ceased to hold its form, edges bleeding into the surrounding darkness until nothing remained but the empty piano bench. The instant the figure vanished completely, warmth rushed back into the room. The oppressive cold lifted, and I gasped, sucking in air as if I'd been underwater. My legs shook as I stood from the chair, one hand still gripping its arm for support. I stared at the now empty music room, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. There was no rational explanation for what had happened. No trick of light could create those hands, that figure, those eyes. No hidden speaker system could produce music that penetrated my very thoughts. I returned to the desk on unsteady feet, pulling out Donald's list of rules with trembling hands. I read through them again, each one taking on new significance. These weren't the eccentricities of wealthy homeowners. They weren't pranks to haze new guards. They were warnings, specific, vital instructions for surviving in a house that contained things beyond normal understanding. I thought about the woman in red I'd seen earlier, how she'd vanished between one blink and the next. I'd broken the rule by speaking to her. What consequences might follow that mistake? Rule number 2 warned against answering the door between midnight and 4 a.m. Rule 4 said not to enter rooms containing more than 4 people, but how could that apply in an empty house? Rule 5 instructed me to respond to my name only after the 3rd repetition. I'd thought these were absurd when I first read them. Now they seemed like a lifeline, the only protection I had against whatever existed within these walls. I checked my watch. Just past 1:30 in the morning. I had hours until sunrise, hours to navigate this impossible situation I'd signed up for. The tablet on the desk flickered again, drawing my attention. The floor plans displayed normally, but as I watched, a single dot of light appeared in the music room. It remained for several seconds, then vanished. I looked up at the security feed showing the music room. The piano sat undisturbed, the bench empty. Nothing moved, nothing changed as I watched. Yet the feeling of being observed had returned, stronger than before. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, counting down the seconds of this endless night. I settled back into the desk chair, keeping the list of rules close at hand. $1,800 a month suddenly seemed far too little for what this job entailed. But I was here until morning, trapped by my own desperate decision to accept this position. All I could do now was follow the rules and hope they were enough to keep me safe from the mansion's other occupants. The next 90 minutes passed in a state of hypervigilance. I couldn't stop staring at the security feeds, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance. The tablet remained normal after that single, unexplained dot of light, but my trust in the technology had evaporated. Whatever existed in this mansion clearly didn't play by the rules of ordinary reality. I tried reading my paperback to pass the time, but couldn't focus beyond a paragraph. My mind kept replaying the pianist's unnatural hands moving across the keys, those void-like eyes that had stared directly into mine. The woman in red's sudden disappearance, the footsteps overhead when no one should have been there. The grandfather clock struck 3 times, its deep tones reverberating through the library. 3 in the morning. The dead hour, as my grandmother used to call it. I stretched and paced the room, fighting off the exhaustion that threatened to overcome my nervous energy. The thought of falling asleep in this place was unthinkable. Who knew what might approach while my eyes were closed? As I completed another circuit of the library, I paused. Something new drifted through the air, the faint murmur of conversation punctuated by what sounded like laughter. Multiple voices coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I checked the security feeds again. The cameras showed empty hallways, vacant rooms. But the sounds continued, growing slightly louder. A gathering of some kind, people talking and laughing together. My mind raced through possibilities. Intruders? But the alarm system would have triggered. Staff returning early. Donald had been clear that no one would return until sunrise. More of the mansion's supernatural residents. The sounds seemed to be coming from the direction of the kitchen. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I needed to know what I was dealing with in this house. I moved cautiously through the mansion's corridors, following the sounds. The conversation grew clearer as I approached the kitchen, multiple voices speaking over each other, dishes clinking, occasional bursts of laughter. It sounded like a lively dinner party. The kitchen entrance featured 2 swinging doors. I hesitated outside them, listening to what sounded like at least half a dozen people chatting on the other side. My hands felt clammy as I pushed one door open just enough to peer inside. What I saw made me forget to breathe. The kitchen was filled with people, but not solid, living humans. Translucent figures moved around the space, their forms wavering like heat mirages. A woman in a high-necked Victorian dress stood by what appeared to be a pot on the stove, stirring nothing with an ethereal ladle. Near her, a man in 1920s attire gestured animatedly while telling a story to 2 children dressed in clothing from the 1940s. By the central island, 3 more figures prepared ghostly food that never actually materialized. A teenage boy in a Letterman jacket from perhaps the 1950s, an elderly woman whose clothing suggested the 1970s, and a young woman in a flowing dress from an era I couldn't identify. They moved with purpose, talking and laughing, completely unaware of my presence. Yet despite all this activity, the actual kitchen remained untouched. No real food was being prepared, no physical objects moved. It was like watching a film projected onto the existing space. I counted quickly. 8. There were 8 figures in the kitchen. Rule number 4 crashed into my awareness. Avoid rooms containing more than 4 people. I took a step backward, intending to retreat silently, but my elbow bumped the swinging door, causing it to creak. Every ghostly figure froze simultaneously. Their heads turned toward me with unnatural synchronization, conversation cutting off mid-sentence. For one terrible moment, nothing moved. Then their faces changed. Pleasant expressions twisted into masks of rage and despair. Mouths stretched wide in silent screams, eyes bulged, features contorted beyond human limits. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the stainless steel appliances. I stood paralyzed as the figures began moving toward me, their movements jerky and wrong, like film playing at the wrong speed. Their translucent hands reached out, fingers elongating impossibly as they stretched toward me. "Get out now!" The scream cut through the supernatural silence. It came from a young girl in a typical 1950s dress with a Peter Pan collar and full skirt. Unlike the others, her voice was audible, high, terrified, and urgent. She pointed at me with frantic energy, her face the only one showing fear rather than rage. "They'll take you! Run!" My paralysis broke. I backed away as the kitchen itself began to change. The walls seemed to stretch and contract, angles bending in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. The ceiling rose impossibly high while simultaneously pressing down. Doorways narrowed and widened in pulsing rhythms. The ghostly figures pressed forward, their forms growing more solid with each step. What had been translucent was now gaining opacity, color bleeding into their previously muted forms. The Victorian woman's hand closed around a very real kitchen knife. I turned and ran. Behind me, the swinging doors burst open. The sound of pursuit filled the corridor. Not footsteps, but a rushing noise like wind through a tunnel, punctuated by wails that no human throat could produce. I sprinted down the hallway, turning corners at random. Nothing looked familiar anymore. Corridors stretched longer than physically possible. Doorways appeared where none had been before. Stairs led to walls instead of upper floors. The mansion itself seemed alive and hostile, rearranging its architecture to trap me. Paintings on the walls changed their subjects as I passed, figures and portraits turning to track my movement with hateful eyes. The pursuing entities gained ground. I could feel the air growing colder at my back, hear their incoherent howls closing in. I had no plan beyond putting distance between myself and them, running blindly through a house that no longer matched the floor plans I'd studied. I rounded a corner and found myself in what looked like the main entrance hall, though it appeared twisted and elongated compared to how I remembered it. The front door stood at the far end, impossibly distant. I ran toward it anyway, feet pounding against marble that felt increasingly insubstantial beneath me. The howling behind me reached a fever pitch, the air so cold my lungs burned with each breath. As I reached the center of the front hall, the sounds of pursuit abruptly stopped. The temperature returned to normal so suddenly it felt like passing through a barrier. I staggered to a halt, gasping for breath, and turned around. The hallway behind me was empty. No ghostly figures, no distorted architecture. Just the normal, opulent corridor I'd seen during Donald's tour. Whatever force had been chasing me had stopped at the threshold of the entrance hall. I doubled over, hands on my knees, struggling to catch my breath. My heart raced so fast I thought it might explode. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the lingering chill in the air. When I straightened up, I noticed the grandfather clock in the corner of the entrance hall. Its face showed 20 minutes past 3. The entire encounter had lasted less than half an hour, though it felt like hours had passed. I moved to one of the antique chairs positioned along the wall and collapsed into it, trying to process what had just happened. The mansion hadn't just housed supernatural entities, it had warped reality itself in response to my presence where I shouldn't have been. I thought back to Donald's list of rules. They weren't suggestions or eccentricities. They were survival instructions. Each one probably addressed a specific danger within these walls. I'd broken Rule 4 by entering a room with more than 4 people, and only the warning from the ghost girl had given me enough time to escape. Whatever fate awaited those who violated the mansion's rules. As my breathing steadied, I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and read through the remaining rules again. I still had nearly 3 hours until sunrise, 3 hours to avoid making any more potentially fatal mistakes. The mansion had fallen silent again, but the silence felt watchful, calculating. I pushed myself up from the chair on shaky legs. I needed to return to the library, the only place that had felt even remotely safe since this night began. I stayed in the entrance hall for several minutes, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. When no ghostly figures appeared, I gradually made my way back toward the library, moving cautiously through the mansion's corridors. Each corner I turned, each threshold I crossed felt like a potential trap, but the hallways remained blessedly normal. No stretching walls or impossible geometries. The security monitor showed what it had all night: empty rooms, undisturbed furnishings. If not for my racing heart and the lingering chill in my bones, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the entire encounter in the kitchen. I checked my watch. Nearly 3:30 in the morning. I still had hours to go before sunrise. I paced the library, keeping Donald's list of rules clutched in my hand like a talisman. The one about avoiding rooms with more than 4 people made horrible sense now. The ghost girl had saved me. Her warning had given me the precious seconds needed to escape. But why would she help me when the others clearly meant harm? The remainder of the night passed in a fog of vigilance and exhaustion. I jumped at every creak of the old house settling, at every tick of the grandfather clock. Twice I heard my name called from somewhere in the house, soft, almost plaintive, but remembered Rule 5, respond only after the 3rd repetition. Each time, I held my breath, waiting for a 3rd call that never came. At some point, I saw movement on one of the security feeds, a figure in red drifting across the dining room. I looked away quickly, not wanting to make the same mistake twice. When I dared to look back, the feed showed an empty room. I didn't explore any further. The library became my fortress, and I remained inside its walls, watching the security feeds and listening to the sounds of the house. Occasionally, faint music drifted through the corridors. Not the piano this time, but something older, like distant strings playing a waltz. Laughter echoed from the upper floors. Footsteps paced overhead. The grandfather clock struck 4, then 5. With each passing hour, my terror gave way to a strange, almost delirious exhaustion. I found myself nodding off despite my best efforts, jerking awake at the slightest sound. When the clock struck 6, I noticed the first change. The absolute darkness outside the windows had softened to a deep blue. The faint sounds throughout the mansion, the whispers, the footsteps, the distant music, began to fade like a radio being slowly turned down. As the sky lightened further, I felt the oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion all night beginning to lift. The air itself seemed to change, becoming lighter, more ordinary. The unnatural cold that had lingered in corners and doorways dissipated. By 6:30, I could see the garden outside taking shape in the gray dawn light. The ghostly activities had ceased entirely. The mansion felt empty. Not the watchful, malevolent emptiness of the night, but the simple absence of activity. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the trees in the garden. I stood up, my muscles stiff from hours of tense waiting. I didn't know what sunrise meant exactly, but Donald had said my shift ended then. I had survived the night. Relief flooded through me. I gathered my few belongings and headed toward the front door. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if the mansion itself was releasing its hold on me. I reached the entrance hall just as the first direct sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long golden rectangles across the marble floor. The sudden light made the shadows retreat like living things scurrying away. I moved quickly to the front door, propelled by an urgent need to be outside, to breathe air that hadn't been trapped in this place all night. My hand closed around the doorknob. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might not open, that I might be trapped here forever, but it turned easily under my grip, and I pulled the heavy door open. Cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass and earth. I practically fell outside, stumbling onto the wide front steps, gulping fresh air into my lungs. I collapsed against the front door, gasping for breath as dawnlight filtered through the trees. The weight of the night, the terror, the confusion, the constant vigilance crashed over me in a wave. My legs trembled, threatening to give out entirely. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." I nearly jumped out of my skin. Donald Coleman stood at the bottom of the steps, looking as perfectly composed as he had when I arrived. His black suit showed not a wrinkle, his posture ramrod straight despite his age. He might have been there all along, or appeared between one blink and the next. I couldn't be sure. "The night shift always ends at sunrise," he said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "Are you ready for the changing of the guard?" I stared at him, unable to form words. How could he act so normal after everything that had happened? Did he know what took place inside those walls at night? Of course he did. The rules, the specific warnings. Donald knew exactly what haunted the mansion. Yes, I finally managed, my voice hoarse. Donald nodded once, as if my stunned response was perfectly satisfactory. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the circular driveway where a sleek black car now sat. I hadn't heard it arrive. Standing beside the car was Richard Hayes, dressed in another impeccable dark suit. He looked refreshed and alert, a stark contrast to my disheveled, exhausted state. I made my way down the steps on unsteady legs, aware of how I must look, pale, sweaty, my clothing rumpled from the night's ordeals. "Mr. Walker," Richard greeted me, extending his hand. "Congratulations." I shook his hand automatically, noticing how cold his fingers felt against mine. "For what?" "For surviving your trial night, of course." His thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. Most guards quit after their first encounter with our residents. I looked back at the mansion, imposing even in daylight. Those weren't just hallucinations or tricks. "No," Richard said simply. "They were not." "What are they?" Richard considered me for a moment. "Previous occupants, one might say. This property has a long and complex history. The current owners have learned to coexist with its permanent residents." I thought about the woman in red, the pianist with impossible hands, the ghostly kitchen gathering that had turned violent. Coexist? They tried to kill me. Only because you entered a room with more than 4 of them present, Richard said, as if explaining something to a child. The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Walker. Follow them precisely, and you'll be perfectly safe. He reached into his car and produced a leather bag, offering it to me. Your payment for the night, $900, as agreed. I took the bag, feeling its weight. More cash than I'd seen in months. I'd like to offer you the permanent position, Richard continued. 2 nights per month, as we discussed. $1,800 monthly, paid in cash. No taxes, no paperwork beyond our private contract. I should have said no. Anyone with sense would have walked away, gotten in their car, and never looked back. But the weight of that leather bag in my hand, the promise of financial security after weeks of desperate job hunting. The same rules apply each night? I asked. Richard nodded. They never change. Follow them exactly, and you'll be perfectly safe. I thought about my empty bank account, my upcoming rent, the stack of bills waiting at home. I thought about the $1,800 monthly for just 2 nights of work. Terrifying work, yes, but only 2 nights. I'll do it, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could reconsider. Richard's expression didn't change, but I sensed satisfaction in his nod. Excellent. Donald will contact you with the dates for your next shift. He handed me a business card. Call this number if anything comes up. That's it? No. I don't know. Training? Explanation? You've had your training, Richard said, opening his car door. You survived. That's more than most can say. He paused. Is there anything specific you'd like to know? 1,000 questions raced through my mind. What were those things? Why did they behave differently? How long had they been there? What happened to guards who broke the rules? But in the end, I asked the most practical question. What if I need to cancel a shift? Don't, Richard said simply. The mansion requires attendance on specific nights. Find a way to be here. His tone left no room for negotiation. He slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and started the engine. The window lowered smoothly. Welcome to the staff, Mr. Walker. I believe this arrangement will be beneficial for all parties involved. With that, he drove away, the expensive car crunching over the gravel driveway. Donald had already disappeared back into the mansion, leaving me alone on the front steps. I looked down at the leather bag in my hand, then back at the mansion. Sunlight sparkled off its many windows, making it look almost welcoming. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, those same walls had housed horrors that defied explanation. I walked to my car on legs that still felt weak. As I climbed in and placed the bag of cash on the passenger seat, the reality of my situation finally sank in. I had just agreed to return to a house filled with ghosts, entities that could manipulate reality, that could potentially harm or kill me if I broke their rules. I had agreed to be their night guardian, paid a small fortune for my willingness to coexist with the dead, the strangest, most terrifying, and most lucrative job of my life.